Hello and welcome to episode 408 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Parrott, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. How are you this fine July the 9th, Bill?
I'm doing great. Looking for a cup of coffee.
We're going to get that in a minute. With us, and we are always glad to have him. It's been too long. Is our good friend, fantastic historian, good buddy Jon Parshall. How are you today, Jon?
I am doing great. I'm really excited to be back here. So
yeah, we're always glad to have you here, my man.
Yeah.
So to cue off of what Bill said, you've heard us talk about Old Salt coffee before. We're going to do it again today. Old Salt Coffee was started by a couple of Navy veterans with a passion for Navy culture and history. Their mission statement is, quote, bring sailors together, past and present, to share their sea stories over a cup of Old Salt coffee. These guys are really, really, really super cool. They are not a sponsor of the show. Let me be abundantly clear. We don't get anything out of this. We did get a couple of bags of free coffee, but the coffee is really, really good. These guys are super cool. It is. It's awesome. I've tried, I think, every one that they have now. It's really good stuff. They're really good people, and they want to support our show while we support them at the same time. It's a kind of win-win situation. So they're offering a discount code, 20% off of anything you order from their shop if you use the code Pacific Podcast 20 at
all one word.
Yes, all one word, and it's at their website, which is, of course, obviously www.oldsaltcoffee.com. They also, just so everybody knows, they support nonprofits with every bag of coffee that you buy. They support the Tailhook Educational Foundation, Battleship Cove, USS Missouri, USS New Jersey Memorials, Dolphin Scholarship Foundation, Special Operations Warrior Foundation. These guys are super, super cool, so give them a shot if you haven't already done so. And I'll put the link up on the screen and the discount code, and have at it. It's definitely good stuff.
I'm remiss in not having my my cup from there. This my favorite teacup, and I don't drink coffee, but my wife does, and I got her a bag of their stuff, and she's like, "This is nummy." So yeah. She liked the Battleship blend.
So that is good.
Anyway. I don't drink coffee either. I consume it in large quantities. I'm not sure. I think there's a difference.
Bill's coffee is so dark you have to eat it with a fork. So
right,
yeah, the spoon stands up.
That's right,
in the middle of the coffee. Yeah, go ahead.
It's Navy style.
That's how any red-blooded American should drink their coffee. It's black as night. Black as night. So, all right. Anyway, on with today's show. Throughout history, man has done battle with nature. Man has created lakes where none existed before, only to have them dry up. Man has tried to reroute rivers only to have floods of biblical proportions, New Orleans. Man has tried to hold back those same rivers with levees, New Orleans, only to have those levees break numerous times.
New Orleans.
Indeed. Man has tried to re-landscape mountains only to have them fall in avalanches, and so on, and so on, and so on. The gist of all this is to say that Mother Nature is undefeated and will always remain so. Yet Mother Nature wasn't the only undefeated force at work in December 1944. Yes, we're taking a step back in time. From its debut in November 43, all through the year 44, the American Fast Carrier Task Force 58 or 38, depending on who was in command, was an unstoppable force. Nothing, literally nothing, could stop the Big Blue Fleet. Japanese tried their dead-level best multiple times. At Philippine Sea, they were annihilated by Spruance and Mitcher's ships over a period of 2 days. At Leyte Gulf, Halsey and Mitcher took the Japanese to the woodshed. Shipping losses suffered by the fast carriers were virtually nil. USS Princeton was sunk in the opening stages of Leyte Gulf, making her the first and only fast carrier of the Fast Carrier Task Force to be sunk. Screening ships of the fleet were damaged here and there and forced to retire to repair facilities, but by and large, the Japanese had not been able to lay a heavy hand on any of the ships, of the all-powerful naval task force that roamed at will throughout the broad blue Pacific. In December 1944, and again in June 1945, the Big Blue Fleet would meet her match. Mother Nature would take a swipe, actually, at the unstoppable fleet and do what the Japanese never could: inflict heavy damage on the world's most powerful sailing force. And both times that Mother Nature went toe-to-toe with the U.S. Navy, she faced the same adversary, Admiral William Halsey. And what would be, according to Fleet Admiral King, Halsey's two biggest blunders, Mother Nature and the Typhoon she would spin up would do what she always does, win. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, baby. Absolutely.
So by December 1944, and all through the year, Halsey's fleet, Task Force 38, had been pretty much at sea the entire time. They had been roaming everywhere. They'd been flying a ton of missions. They were worn to an absolute frazzle. And we've talked about this before. When we did Leyte Gulf, we talked about this. But these guys were worn to a frazzle. He was desperately clamoring to get his ships out of there and give them a brief respite. But Bill, and John, let's get into why they were hanging around into December 1944. And partially, most of that is because the situation as it was on Leyte Island is, it was virtually impossible to operate aircraft at this stage from Leyte because of the fields. So the fleet had to stay around. Go ahead, Bill. I see you pointing.
Yeah, John.
Well, I was pointing too, because that to me raises a question around, just how much. Okay, the basic issue is that in order to capture Leyte, our ground forces have to have air support. If we can't run our airfields, and there's just not very much good terrain on Leyte to make that happen, and this is becoming more and more apparent the longer this campaign is going on. Well, that means that the air support has got to come from naval vessels, carriers.
Right. Exactly.
But the issue I have here is how much of that support is actually being provided by Halsey's fleet versus the Jeep carriers that are operating in that neck of the woods as well. Because, I look at Halsey's fleet, and basically this is a force that is configured not to do so much ground support as air suppression. I mean, destroying airfields, shooting down enemy planes, and that kind of stuff. But you don't have a lot of hotshot, dive bomber pilots on here who are like, yeah, I'm just aching to put bombs on bunkers. That's not really what these guys do.
Right.
So insofar as Halsey is making the claim that, I've got to stick around because, MacArthur is expecting me to show up, I'm sure there is some of that. But my sense is that is more oriented towards prepping Luzon for invasion later in January and going after the airfields there than it really is for ground support.
Absolutely, 100%. And the Japanese were launching massive, by this time, to this stage of the war, massive kamikaze assaults on the fleet at this point, coming from Luzon.
Right.
And this is a tactic and thing we haven't even discussed yet. And of course we will, but we haven't even discussed the kamikazes. But in December 44, all the way up through January 45, these guys are laying the wood. The Japanese are laying the wood to the American fleet. And that's not just Third Fleet, but it's Seventh Fleet too.
Yeah.
So they're taking a beating. And this is the point in the war where the U.S. Navy, where the Big Blue Fleet unveils the Big Blue Blanket, as they called it, which was basically, as you were just saying, aerial suppression over the island of Luzon.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and Seth, I'm not sure at this point they knew that the kamikaze thing was here to stay. It's easy to look back and say, yeah, this is going to be a real threat, but it's a threat to the fleet. And then the fleet's not there to defend itself. The fleet's there to support the land battle, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that, it became obvious over time, but this relationship we talked about in season 1 that developed between MacArthur and Halsey, I think Halsey felt a kinship. I hate to say it this way.
Right.
To MacArthur,
that word.
Some of his decisions. Go ahead.
No, just the usage of the word kinship in relation to MacArthur just sort of sets my blood chill. But
mine too, anyway. By the way.
Yeah.
But I mean, MacArthur does some unholy thing. Wrong. Halsey does some unholy things in the days we're going to talk about coming up here that don't make sense in hindsight, right? Because of the benefit of hindsight. But at the time and at the place that they were making the decisions, I can kind of see what he was thinking.
Yeah. With respect to the kamikazes, too, you're absolutely right that this is an evolving threat, and we don't really have our arms around it at this point, because the very first attacks, of course, were carried out by very well-trained Japanese aviators, Lieutenant Seki and some of the group from his air group. And so the Japanese are not really starting to make the transition to this sort of mass-produced crappy aviators in the cockpits. Their first lead units were actually pretty good. Meanwhile, the Americans are like, is this for real? Are you kidding me? These guys are actually diving into our ships, and so there's a lot of evolving going on here in terms of the American response to this particular fleet defense problem. And the Philippines present a really difficult environment to make that defense happen, because just the nature of this being an archipelago means that the Japanese can do a lot more of their transits over land when they're coming in, and just pop out and go hit a jeep carrier that's operating relatively close offshore. This is a very different environment that we're going to see when we get to Okinawa, which is really sort of the apex of the whole kamikaze thing. Anyway, for what that's worth. So,
all that is to say that the fleet was busy, though. That's the key. That's the key takeaway.
Super busy. Yep.
Halsey's fleet, Task Force 38, is thumping. They are definitely getting things done. They're working to the razor's edge of exhaustion. By the end of November 1944, the airfield status that we had kind of briefly mentioned on Lady, and there's a whole discussion we can have on that's frankly not necessarily germane to this. Just suffice it to say that the airfield on Tacloban specifically was not yet ready for American aircraft, and it would take some significant engineering feats to get that ready.
Right.
By the end of November, that airfield is somewhat ready. So the Task Force 38 group can actually get out of Dodge for a little while. And they do that very thing. They leave the area at the end of November, and they drop anchor in Ulithi on December 1st, 1944. This wasn't the rest that Halsey specifically wanted, but something was better than nothing. And
right.
Exactly. And to go back to that point, remember when we talked about Leyte Gulf, these guys were smoked. They'd never stopped after Leyte Gulf. It went all the way through November until now. So this is really the first rest that 38 has received. So, Bill, you got the map up. You want to show us what we're talking about here?
Yeah, just to review, remember Tacloban is down here in the Leyte area, and then Ulithi, where we've got the major fleet anchorage, where they can resupply, get some R&R, is over here. It looks like, as the crow flies, that's about 800 miles, folks. That's a long way
exactly
away.
That. Yeah, it's 800 miles. Yeah.
And then you got Luzon up here, which is where these aircraft are coming from, the kamikazes that are coming down here. Of course, the 7th Fleet came up from the south, and they include many of the jeep carriers that I think those are the ones that, John, you're talking about. And the next campaign is going to be up here in Lingayen, which is up by Baguio in the Philippines here. So that kind of gives you a layout of what's going on until the fleet gets underway to come back to the Philippines and support MacArthur again.
Yeah, right. And that's exactly what has to happen. They leave on they being Task Force 38, leaves Ulithi on December 11th, 1944. They're bound for the Philippines again to lend Mac a hand and the army ashore in Leyte, and to beat down these Japanese defenses and aerial opposition ashore on Luzon. Right. So, this is back to what we talked about. The kamikazes had become a thorn in the side, and they were continuing that thorn was getting bigger seemingly by the day. And once in the area, the Task Force 38 deployed what we just mentioned, the big blue blanket, which is essentially keeping aircraft over Luzon, not 24 hours a day, but most of the day, to suppress anything that takes off.
Yep.
And they do it. It's a tactic that works. It works significantly. So much so that nearly 300 Japanese aircraft are destroyed outright from December 14th through the 16th. That's a lot of damn planes. Most of those, admittedly, are on the ground. And I forget I had the number. I thought I had the number, but most of those aircraft were destroyed on the ground. It was less than 100, I think, that were destroyed in aerial combat itself. So the big blue blanket is indeed working. But, the fleet is again operating at this high tempo that they've been operating at, since October. And this is what's going to bring us to the point that's going to be this overriding issue through these storms that we're going to talk about, which is fuel. There is a lack of fuel because, Bill, you can speak to this far better than I and John, but the the fleet is, when they're making these runs into throw this big blue blanket on the Luzon, they're high speed runs. So they're going in there, at full bore. And that means the carriers, the battle wagons, the cruisers, and most importantly, the destroyers. They're running, maybe not at flank speed, but certainly at full speed. They're getting out there, doing their thing, turning around, coming back. And it's literally, it's like a boomerang, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
Yep.
And they're sucking fuel down at an unbelievable rate. Bill, have you ever had any experiences with like these high speed runs ins and outs to anything like that?
Well, certainly, and I've absolutely done unreps before while riding surface ships. My submarine reactor didn't require any replenishment at all, but the diesel engine did. And so there's two ways to get fuel on board. You could bring, when they're in Ulithi, they could bring barges alongside and load fuel oil that way. But by this point, we had this underway replenishment or unrep process down to a science. And remember, the innovator here was Chester Nimitz, the same guy who brought the diesel engine to the submarine. He was the same guy who really was the spearhead behind the Combat Information Center, or CIC. Nimitz was a real innovator. It was easier to refuel at sea underway. That's the bottom line. You didn't have to take these big barges and move them around one ship at a time. You could do a bunch of ships. You can underway very quickly, one on either side of the tanker. You even could unrep from aircraft carriers or battleships, believe it or not. Yes. So it was the doctrine and the technology was such that this was way easier. So it's not surprising they got underway from Ulithi. They got to the scene, and one of the first things they have to talk about doing is underway replenishment.
Mm-hmm. Typically, too, what they would be doing is, if the fleet has got 3 or 4 task groups, you're going to be, using 3 of those up front, and you've probably got a 4th one in the back that is doing unrep, and then it's going to move forward, take the place of the next one. So they're not only do you have this boomerang effect from the fleet as a whole, but you've also got this constant parade of one of those groups going back and replenishing not only fuel, but also ammunition, picking up spare planes, getting new pilots in some case too. Yeah, by the time you get to this point in the war's development, we've just got this down to an art form.
And it's something, we did occasionally in the beginning of the war. And you got to remember, in the beginning of the war, most of our operations were relatively close to Pearl Harbor. And then later, Guadalcanal, is relatively close to Australia, and Espiritu Santo and those kind of places. And unreps were done, but nothing like in 1944, 45.
Yeah.
With the fleet constantly at sea, and they were, underway replenishment was not a daily occurrence by any means, but certainly multiple times a week almost.
Yeah.
It's like filling up the truck when you're going home from, coming home from work.
Right.
And it's a delicate ballet. And I think, we don't need to get deep into the weeds of this, but it's interesting. And I know people would enjoy hearing about this kind of thing. Bill, take us through an unrep at sea.
Okay, so the ship that has the fuel it decides what course it's going to do the unrep on, because it wants a course that's going to allow it to be stable. You don't want the head of the ship bobbing back and forth, because as the other ships pull alongside, a vortex is created between the two ships that causes a low pressure zone in the water that can pull the 2 ships together. So you want your best helmsman on the helm of each ship as you're doing this. The outboard helmsmen, the ones that are taking on the fuel, are going to cheat away from the ship they're refueling from, because otherwise they're going to be pulled into that ship. A line is passed, and as soon as that line is made taut, then the refueling hose is passed from the ship that's giving the fuel to the ship that's receiving it. It is what you said, Seth. It's a delicate ballet that's rehearsed, and the watchstanders who man every watch as you're doing this have to be on their game to do this. You have emergency procedures. So if something goes awry, you can break away quickly, and everybody knows what courses to come to. So this is very delicate, but when done right, you can be done in 20, 30 minutes. This is incredible, right? Because you can pump at very high rates of flow. And so This is, again, much easier and quicker when it's done right than it would be doing it pierside.
Yeah.
So average, if you're going to refuel a destroyer that's empty, and I mean like sucking fumes damn near, you're looking at between, 3 to 4 hours, according to what I was finding. Carriers are
Mhm.
going to be, or, I'm sorry, a battleship, I'm sorry, 3 to 4 hours. And a carrier is going to be about the same. Because I mean, these things hold, hundreds of
A lot of
thousands of
fuel.
gallons of oil, fuel
Mhm.
oil. Destroyers, if they're low, you're looking at it about an hour and a half, 2 hours, I think. And I mean, by low, I'm talking sucking fumes. It's going to take a little bit of time. And exactly to your point, the seas don't have to be glassy, but they got to be at least manageable. And that I
Yeah.
think that's the key here, is that they have to be manageable. So to fuel his fleet, Halsey's going to have to steam east, which is away from any aerial threat to his fleet, which is, very reasonable. He
Right.
doesn't want to have his ships cruising, fueling at
Yeah.
10 knots, sitting ducks, and get hit by kamikazes, because that's just going to be utter disaster.
Right.
So he needs to get the heck away from Luzon. The task force that's good, the replenishment group is 30.8. Task force 30.8 is a replenishment group. They're going to be waiting for the fleet. 30.8 numbered over 100 ships by 1944, including 3 dozen oilers. John, put that in the, yeah.
It's just, again, by the standards of 1942, that is just so completely extra, just so completely over the top that it's hard to even think about. I mean, you think about the loss of the Oiler Neosho at the Battle of Coral Sea. Basically, okay, I guess the battle's over because we're out of gas. We got to go home now. So, yeah, again, just the size and sophistication of the logistical forces that are backing this fleet up now are just night and day. Doesn't even really suffice to paint the picture of just how completely over the top it is now. 30 Oilers? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
It's absurd.
And that's
But yeah,
just that's fleet oilers. That's not even commercial tankers. That's
right,
fleet oilers, which is
right,
a whole nother breed of cat.
yeah,
That's a
The
completely
ones that
different
do the
animal.
replenishment.
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seth, I want to make one point here that there is a sweet spot as to what percentage of fuel you have before you refuel, right?
mm,
Ideally, you'd be like to be 80% all the time. But if you do that, you're going through this event very often, very frequently.
Sure.
But you want to be at 80% or above before you go into combat operations or before you get into any situation where you may have to run a long period of time without refueling. So, but if you let the fuel get down too low, it becomes an emergency. And whatever you wanted to do operationally, you can't do anymore because you need to because you're going to be forced to refuel instead of doing what the enemy is dictating. And
right.
sometimes, Seth, the enemy is Mother Nature.
She's yeah. And as we said, she's undefeated. So for those interested, the logistical train kind of went like this. US commercial tankers would bring the oil, fuel, avgas, whatever it was, from the United States, usually the West Coast, but not always, into the Pacific, bypassing Pearl Harbor most of the time. The tankers would go directly to forward bases like Ulithi, where they would then unload their cargo into the fleet oilers, and the fleet oilers, like USS Cimarron was one, who would then bring that fuel oil, or like John was saying, ammunition, or the tankers wouldn't bring ammunition, but other ships of that group would bring ammunition and food and God knows what else. Kind of like, as I put in the notes, like an enormous bucket brigade.
Right.
And it's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
So
And these fleet
good.
these fleet oilers, in many cases too, not only are they bringing bunker fuel, but they would also have barreled lighter distillates like lubricating oils and in some cases kerosene, other solvents and whatnot. So while they're pumping over the side,
They're
they're also
shipping.
yeah, you need a couple barrels of lubricating oil. Yeah, we got that for you too. So yeah, it's pretty sophisticated stuff. Again, just 30 fleet oilers. Just to put it in perspective, when we started the war in the Pacific, we had 6. There were 6 oilers, and my friend Sam Ricagliano is I think working on a book on those 6 oilers, and I'm hopeful to see it at some point because I just find this stuff super interesting because I'm a nerd. Anyway, all right,
Well, like you said, if you don't have the gas, you can't very well
yeah,
drive
you
the
can't move.
car.
No va.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway,
Can't go anywhere.
Mhm.
So we need to talk about patrol aircraft, which is something we haven't really we've touched on it here and there in different episodes, but they're extremely important to this very particular episode. So probably more useful in the Pacific than arguably any other theater of the war because of the massive expanse of territory that we're having, not just us, but the Japanese too. But for this case, we're going to talk about us, for the massive expanse of territory that we have to go through, a tremendous amount of space, literally the world's largest ocean. On December 16th, 1944, the crew of a Martin PBM Mariner was making its routine patrol some 550 miles west-northwest of Ulithi. The crew from VPN 21 was on its routine patrol searching for any enemy activity while also recording weather activity and reporting that to local weather offices upon return. Typhoon season in the Pacific is between June and December, not unlike here in the States when it's June and November, which really, frankly, it's June through the rest of the damn year here anyway. As such, the crew from VPN 21 was instructed to report any signs of increasing weather and indications of a tropical cyclone for obvious reasons. They're in the heart of typhoon season at that time. So sometime around midnight on the 16th or 17th of December, 1944, the PBM reported weather conditions worsening in their area of patrol. Aircraft reported heavy clouds and thunderstorms, which was admittedly not unusual, yet the winds were. Winds in excess of 65 knots were reported, which were not typhoon strength, but not very far from it, frankly. The location of the disturbance was only 250 miles southeast of Task Force 38. So these guys send their report and they head home. And this is where things start to get a little botched, to put it mildly.
Well, and part of the problem is here too. First of all, we're in the days before there is any such thing as a weather satellite. And as Bill showed us on the map too, this area of ocean between the Marianas Islands in the east and the Philippines in the west, you got 1,200 nautical miles of nothing. And so, patrol airplanes like this really are your only way of sussing out what the local weather conditions are going to be. And there are just huge patches of ocean where these typhoons can start to, do their thing, and no one's around to see them except the occasional plane. And so, if you have a sighting report of this kind of a phenomenon that doesn't get processed in an expeditious fashion, you have a problem.
And it most certainly does not.
Yeah.
It does not. So once the PBM gets within range, they send the report. It is received aboard the seaplane tender Chandeleur. While they were officially part of the Third Fleet, this group here, they did not make their reports known directly to Halsey. So the reports stayed aboard the seaplane tender. And this is what I say, December 16th, 17th, 1944. They were reporting, admittedly, not a typhoon, but a strong storm that was building in intensity. Roughly an hour later, another PBM radioed Chandeleur with a similar report. Clearly, there was some nasty weather in the mix, Bill.
Yeah, and so I'm going to go over a couple of things today in the form of a tutorial, folks. For those of you who aren't Navy dudes and dudettes. So I'm going to show you a map because there's something called the 1, 2, 3 rule. And Seth just said that this report was that the storm system was roughly 250 miles away from the location of Third Fleet. So what the 1, 2, 3 rule is, 3 days before a storm system develops, you want to stay outside this 300-mile radius of where you think the storm's track is going to be. And the reason this radius is so big is because uncertainty as to where the storm could go. We know when storms approach land, they do things like recurve and they do other things. And I'm going to go through some rules here. These are Northern Hemisphere rules when I talk about counterclockwise, but they pertain to the Southern Hemisphere as well. Of course, we're in the Northern Hemisphere right now. 48 hours, if you have a sighting that says you may be 48 hours away from the storm, you can reduce that area of uncertainty to 200 miles and make sure that your ship's track stays out of this 200-mile area of uncertainty. 24 hours, it's still 100 miles, folks. And that's outside 100 miles outside where you think the edge of the storm may be. So they've got some pretty good rules here already in place. If they kind of know where the storm is, 250 miles away, they should be adhering to this 300-mile radius. So somebody ought to be laying on a chart. Okay, these storms generally tend to move to the northwest historically. And by the way, the folks on board these ships had decades worth of historical records of how these storms moved.
Yep.
And they know they generally move at 15 to 20 knots, so they can give some estimate as to where this uncertainty circle would be. So at this point, a prudent mariner, and I'm going to underscore the word prudent, I should underscore the word mariner as well, because it's very clear that a lot of these people were not mariners. To give them a break here, I'll say that many of them were civilians before the war began, right?
Sure.
So maybe many of them didn't know these rules, but Halsey certainly did.
Yeah.
And some of the other people we're going to talk about certainly did. So they should already have been plotting out this avoidance area, place to stay away from. Go ahead, Seth.
Well, I have a legitimate uninformed question for you, Bill, because admittedly I saw your diagrams before we recorded this, but I didn't get the Captain Bill Tody explanation. This was something that they had in fleet operations in 1944?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
This is ancient mariner science here.
Okay.
Nothing I'm going to talk about winds in a little while.
Okay.
All of this was well understood. Now, what the point that John made earlier was there's no weather satellites back then. So there was nothing that could take a picture to say exactly where this storm was.
Right.
But that PBY reported it, right? Reported PBM, reported the location.
It did. And this is the important part here too. So at that second report that we just talked about, or just a minute ago, an aerologist aboard Chandelure named Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Young, he read that second report for what it was. So he's taking two reports and going, okay, this is, again, there's that old saying, if you get, a couple people saying you're drunk, hand over the keys. There's something going on here. There's definitely something amiss. Based on those two weather reports made by the PBMs, Lieutenant J.G. Robert Young, issued an official weather warning and addressed it to Halsey, Kincaid, as well as the weather station Pearl Harbor. So the information was out there, but where is the key? And by that, I mean, it was in the ether, but it hadn't actually gotten to the hands that it needed to be, as we shall see.
Right.
So as Third Fleet rendezvoused with the replenishment fleet, it became obvious that a great many of the ships in the fleet, and Bill, this goes back to what you were talking about a minute ago, were dangerously low on fuel. Not just low on fuel, but like, the little light came on the dashboard. They are dangerously low on fuel. Having last refueled on December 13th, the ships had been moving all over God's creation and sucked down bunker oil at an alarming rate. The high-speed runs in and out are generally what was the cause of this. So, Bill, you had a note in here about this is a significant decision that has to be made at this point.
Yeah, so, weight constitutes ballast.
Mm-hmm.
Ballast results in stability. So if you have a bunch of tanks filled with air, you're more buoyant. And if you've got rough seas, that buoyancy causes you to bob around. Bobbing around results in instability. So you want those fuel tanks to be full of something. If you know you're going into rough weather and you can't refuel, what you would normally do is fill those tanks with seawater. And people are going to say, seawater and oil, doesn't that ruin your engines? No, actually the fuel oil floats on top of the seawater. And so you could suck the seawater out when you need the fuel. But the point is, they would have normally ballasted down with seawater, except they thought that they were going to be refueling. And if you ballast down, it takes you 4 to 5 hours to pump that seawater out so that you could pump the fuel oil in. So they're on the horns of a dilemma. And I'll hand it over to John here, because this has kind of reminiscent of
No,
Midway.
you take it. I liked your analogy here.
Oh, well,
That
you know, the point is that Japanese had to think bombs or
right.
torpedoes, and they kept going
Yeah.
back and forth. Same kind of situation exists here. The skippers, excuse me, the skippers of every ship has to think ballast down with seawater or get ready to refuel. If I ballast down, I may not be able to refuel, but I need the fuel.
Yeah.
If I keep the tanks empty to refuel and I hit rough weather, I may be very unstable and may be very unsafe.
Yeah.
This, and by the way, as a reminder, the captain of the ship is responsible.
Mhm.
Okay, each individual captain is responsible for the fate of his own ship.
Yeah.
No amount of blaming the admiral is going to save you if you make the wrong decision here. Seth?
Yeah. And the problem too for some of these skippers is the need to refuel is becoming desperate, and that
Yes.
they're faced with a situation where they may be in rough weather and literally run out of gas in the middle of the ocean. And if you lose power in the middle of heavy weather like this, you sink, because you can't keep your bow pointed into the seas, and you end up turning, your beam to the seas, and then bad things can happen. So
You can't
this
deballast.
is yeah.
Yep.
In
Can't pump the
hindsight, it
bilges.
makes sense to us that we just like, well, ballast. Clearly, that's what they needed to do, but it was not at all an obvious uh, solution to the problem if they're really, really low on fuel.
And
They were
low on
hoping they were going
fuel,
to be able to refuel. Go ahead,
Right.
Seth.
low on fuel they were, and I got figures here. So some of the ships, specifically the DDs, were very low. USS Spence, which you're going to hear her again, DD 512, was at a 15% fuel rate. So I mean that's for those with a car, that's less than a
Yeah.
quarter of a tank.
Yeah.
That is
A
again, the
seventh of a
light
tank.
is on the
Light is
dash.
on.
You better get some gas like right now.
Yeah.
Other destroyers were in similar shape, reporting fuel states ranging from USS Hickox, DD 673, and Maddox 731, each at 10 to 15%. 10% fuel. I
Hurting.
mean, dude, that's bad. That's
Yeah.
bad. So low was the fuel aboard these ships specifically that it was thought if they did not fuel like right now, they're going to run out of fuel in less than 24 hours. And to
Right.
your point, if you're running into bad weather, and by the way, the waves are starting to grow,
Right.
you're going to need every drop of fuel you got.
Yeah. It takes a lot more fuel just to keep station in heavy seas too. You're going to be running your engines pretty intensively because, again, just the ability to keep your bow, which has your best sea keeping properties, pointed into those waves, is dependent on how hard you can run your engines. In some cases, you're going to be running it at cruising speed just to stay even in this sea state. So, anyway.
So
Mm.
I found this to be rather interesting. Aboard the Oilers, and they didn't say which ones and they didn't say who, they just said captains were astonished at the fuel state of the ships that they were having to fuel, shocked that Admiral John McCain, who had taken over for Mark Mitcher had gone back to the beach for some rest, well deserved, I should say, were absolutely shocked that McCain let his destroyers specifically
Get that low.
get that low. There's no reason on earth. I don't care how much you're moving. You should have stopped at the shell and gone to get some gas at some point and not let them get there. It's true. I mean, honest to God, not let them get that damn low. That's irresponsible. That's fault number one, and there's more to come. So just stand by.
Yeah.
Regardless of the seas, it was quite obvious that the fleet had to take fuel. I mean, it's becoming critical for some bigger ships. It is critical for the smallest ships, small boys. Ammunition, stores, fuel, whatever else is needed. They're starting to take these items as the seas, as I said before, are beginning to increase. Around mid-morning, the seas had increased significantly. The first ships were beginning to draw alongside the Oilers at about this time. And while the conditions were bad, and this is key, they were not typhoon conditions yet at this point. Now, John, you live in the north, Minnesota specifically. Bill, you live in Florida. I live in Louisiana. So specifically, John, have you ever been in a hurricane? Have you ever seen a hurricane? You
I have
have.
actually.
You
I've
have.
been in a
Okay.
typhoon in Japan.
Oh, okay. Well, then all three of us have witnessed
Yes.
cyclonic storms,
Yes.
tropical storms, and they build in intensity. So this is not something that's like, it's not a tornado, thank God, where you wake up, boom, that thing's on top of your house. I've always said it's like being stalked by a snail,
Mm,
a hurricane, because it's true. Because especially in New Orleans, you're like, it's coming. So come on, let's get this over with. Let's move on.
right.
But there are indications well ahead of time. This doesn't generally, sometimes it does, but more often than not, there's bad weather, or at the very least, tropical weather 24 to 48 hours before that thing ever hits you. And winds, if nothing else. And it's, you can tell. You can tell. You live in a place long enough, you've been through enough storms, you can tell when it's, even if you don't have the TV on, you can tell when a tropical storm or a hurricane is coming. Sailors, specifically Bill, can tell long before there's ever any kind of report of an actual cyclone, tropical cyclone there. You can tell that
Something's coming.
something's coming.
There's just so much malfeasance going on here from the mariner's standpoint, Seth, that it's almost beyond belief. I mean, the indicators are, number one, I mean, everybody's going to know the barometer begins to fall, right? It falls a little bit for any storm, but it falls. It's the rate that it falls that gives you the indication that typhoon's coming. And the second point is that the wind begins to veer. In a normal storm, the wind's coming at you, comes at you, the storm goes by, and the wind actually stays kind of in the same direction as the storm passes. If the wind veers, and I'm going to show some maps here, it's because the rotation of the storm is changing basically the attack angle where the wind is feeling you. And when we talk about these things, there is this concept called a dangerous semicircle. So I'm going to bring this up right now. Here's the path of the storm. If you're in the dangerous semicircle, the wind in the northern hemisphere, which is rotating counterclockwise, the wind of the storm will actually push you further into the storm, which makes it harder to get out of the way of the storm. Now, I know this, I've been in 2 typhoons at sea. Believe it or not, as a submariner, I had to go through one on the surface because we couldn't get main ballast tank vent covers off before we got underway. That was not fun in a round-hulled ship. But you could shut all the hatches in a submarine, and if you, so you're not going to sink. And the second one I did go through submerged. At 600 feet, we were still rolling, folks. Okay, at 600 feet depth. And so this is a big deal. So that's the dangerous semicircle. Now, here's the part where I say mariner malfeasance, because they're actually, and this is, I'm trying to forgive my simple graphics, folks. I am not. Jon Parshall's the artist here. That ain't me. Okay. I
love the little boat. I love the boat.
I still have kindergarten skills, right? So there's a little boat. See how the wind is pushing the boat in front of the hurricane, which makes it worse. In this case, typhoon. So what happens? You've got rules that you can operate by. If you in the northern hemisphere, if you keep the wind on your starboard quarter, it tends to get you out of the way of the storm. I didn't put another boat here, but imagine the wind being on its starboard quarter. So if you think the wind is veering, you think this might be a cyclonic storm, there is a basic thumb rule you can follow to make sure you get out of the way of the storm. Now, I don't want to cheat and give you a spoiler alert, but and I have a map to show later. Spoiler alert, nobody did what any mariner should have known to do. So.
Right.
And there's a bunch of reasons why, I think, here, but we'll get to that in a second. So the first real problems to arise are, of course, for obvious reasons, flight operations. USS Yorktown CV-10 was conducting flight operations, believe it or not, in this weather, and nearly ran down the cruiser USS Boston that was trying to keep station on the carrier in the increasing winds and seas. The ships of the fleet that are starting to take fuel now are reporting all over the task force that they're having difficulty steering, and that they're having difficulty coming alongside the oilers, making an already hazardous job even more so. They're having trouble even pulling alongside these things to fuel. The seas are getting that bad. Around noon, Admiral McCain ordered his ships to slow to 10 knots to help with the difficult conditions. However, that trick did not work. Reports started coming in all over the fleet that parted lines and near collisions were rapidly becoming a serious problem. Within an hour, the problem had become an epidemic all over the fleet. Especially the oilers are reporting broken lines, fuel spills, lost communication lines, and near collisions. It's becoming a serious issue. And Bill, like you had said in the beginning, and John, you got notes on this too. The oilers are not the only fuelers in the fleet. The battle wagons and carriers, but more often than not, the battleships, because of their cavernous tanks, can also fuel some destroyers. And one of those battleships that was being used as a fueler was none other than USS New Jersey, BB 62, which happened to be Admiral William Halsey's flagship. And this is key. Aboard New Jersey, as fleet aerologist and fleet navigator, was a gentleman named George Cosco. Kosco. Cosco, not Costco, Cosco. He was an academy grad and an MIT graduate, so he was no fool. He was nobody's, no, not at all. And this guy's highly intelligent. He had studied aerology at MIT for 3 years and had plenty of sea duty on top of that. So he was no, wet behind the ears ensign. This guy had been around the block. He was a captain, by the way. His seaman's weather eye should be valuable to Halsey. Bill, how valuable is that seaman's weather eye?
It's very valuable, and I'm just not going to spend a lot of time on this, Seth, because anybody who's a line officer, which is a seagoing officer, seems to have had more sense than this MIT trained, they call them aerologists, we call them meteorologists today, but that's the same thing, seemed to have. And they're just, by the way, things stayed really bad as it pertains to storms for a long time. There's a famous quote, I didn't write it down, I should have. Nimitz said, after these storms, Nimitz wrote down, John, you probably know this by heart, but he talked about the fact that for thousands of years, mariners knew how to react in the face of a storm. And this guy certainly should have. I think he made it worse, Seth.
He didn't help matters any. So at this point that USS New Jersey is fueling, she is fueling where is it? USS Spence.
Spence.
Two
right.
of them. No, she's got two.
Right.
Yeah, she's got two. So Halsey's eating his lunch at this point. There's two DDs alongside this, the Hunt and the Spence, and you're going to hear Spence again, unfortunately, as Hunt specifically begins to fuel. Spence on the other side of New Jersey is struggling to stay alongside the battleship. Now, if you will recall, Spence at this point is less than 15% fuel rate, so she is dang near sucking fumes. Yeah, she is low. Halsey, who was eating his chow, he could not see Spence's hull, but he could see her superstructure because the battleship is obviously significantly taller than is the destroyer alongside. As he's watching, he sees, like he's eating and he's just looking out the porthole and he's watching. He sees Spence take a heavy roll. Yeah, big time. Like a cork in a bathtub. Yeah. And this thing is bobbing all over the compass. The ship did recover. The helmsman was able to recover the roll on the ship. And at that point, Spence went out of control briefly and swung her bow to the port straight for New Jersey. Halsey, seeing this, instinctively ducks. And in an instant, Spence recovered again. Shortly afterwards, she snapped her fuel lines, having taken only 6,000 gallons, which was nowhere near enough fuel that she's going to need to ride out this storm. Yeah. At that point, having witnessed it with his own eyes, again, so I don't know. So he's nervous at this point over what he hears. All these reports are coming in over all across the fleet that, the oilers are snapping lines. The battleships can't keep, fuel going to the DDs or nothing's it's just not working. It's a big kerfluffle at this point. There's a massive mess. The fleet cannot take the fuel. This guy, Costco, his fleet aerologist, is going to play a big part in the conversation that we're about to have. He jumped from lunch after Halsey orders a weather conference in 25 minutes. Costco jumps from his lunch, goes to his office, gathers his latest weather information, and this is key here. And John, you got some things you want to talk about. Costco at this point now did not have Chandelur's weather report that had been issued 12 hours earlier.
Yeah, it's a mess. And when you're a slow moving fleet, as we are now, we're talking, these ships are only moving 10 knots. I'm actually sort of a freak when it comes to weirdo sinkings off in this neck of the woods. They call it Typhoon Alley, and they call it that for a reason. I mean, there's been a lot of ships that have come to grief in this neck of the woods. The Japanese had a problem here in the mid 1930s. Further north, there was a famous, the Fourth Fleet incident where they ran into a typhoon, and a couple of their Fubuki class destroyers lost their bows, and carrier Ryujo got her bridge pounded in. Just a couple 100 miles north of where Halsey's about to get pounded. Back in 1980, there was the loss of a bulk freighter called the MV Derbyshire, the largest British ship that's ever been lost at sea, 91,000 tons that came to grief in a Category 2 typhoon right around here. 42 hands, 2 wives, lost without a trace, just gone. So, Typhoon Alley is legit. It's that you get some really scary weather here because, again, given this vast distance between the Marianas and where you're operating, there's just this enormous amount of fetch where these waves can build. And so you get really, really high wind heights and wave heights. And so the problem then becomes now if you're in the maw of this storm, it's really difficult to get out of the way. And unfortunately, I think Bill is right that Costco is going to make the situation worse.
He does indeed. He winds up Costco. He looks at the reports that he has, which admittedly are not complete, and he uses what information that he can gather just by his own 2 eyeballs and the weather reports that he has, which are few and far between. And he assumes or tries to figure that this storm, if it is indeed a typhoon, and this is the key thing too, he's yet to call it that, is going to be about 400 miles ish to his east. So, Bill, according to your chart, they're within that safe range, one would think, because it's 400 miles to his east. Am I understanding that correctly?
You are, yes.
Okay. So Costco had little to no, and this goes back to your point, John, he had little to no information on that vacant patch of ocean to his east. And this is literally, it's just a big puddle of water. There's nothing there. Very little information had been, nothing at all. So in the weather meeting, Costco relays what little information he had, which again was not that much, and then added that between the fleet and the supposed storm was a cold front, albeit weak. Costco felt that the cold front might shield the fleet from the storm. Bill, what would a cold front do in this situation?
Yeah, remember, this is all about energy, folks. The reason summertime in the in the southern hemisphere too, it's just different months. The reason summertime is when the hurricanes and typhoons happen is because the water heats up and it creates all of this energy. If you've got a cold front, it could buffer that energy, it can reduce the energy. And that will cause the storm to dissipate somewhat. Yeah, exactly. But this is a huge case of wishful thinking. Okay, you've got barometer dropping, you've got wind veering, and you say, well, I think there might be. Come on. If there isn't, you're in big trouble. And if this becomes, we talked about this before, this whole business of operational risk management, which is probability times consequence. Even if you get the probability wrong, the consequence is huge.
Right.
So as a prudent mariner, I'm going to underscore both words, you take the action that's going to keep you safe first.
Yeah.
Not bet on the odds. You don't do that when you're at sea. Seth?
So Halsey gives orders to halt fueling operations, which is wise, although it probably should have started earlier, regardless. Then asks,
you don't even have to give an order to that. You can't do it anymore.
You can't do it. Exactly. It's physically impossible at this point.
Yeah.
Then he asked Costco for his best estimations of a course to stay away from the storm. So Halsey is actually trying to do what he feels is the best situation here. Should the storm continue to build, Costco suggested steaming at a right angle from where he felt the storm was, which is to say northwest of them at this point, which would take the fleet closer to Luzon, however, and the kamikazes. But he felt, Costco did, it was an acceptable risk. What Costco didn't know, it was 10 o'clock in the morning ish, about now. And what the report from Chandeleur would have told him had he had it was that the storm wasn't 400 miles away from the fleet, as Costco believed. It was 200 miles away from the fleet to the east and moving towards him.
So in other words, the course he's recommended takes them into the dangerous semicircle.
Correct.
They should have been going southwest.
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah. Again, using Bill's little chart, if I want to keep those C's on my starboard quarter, yeah, I want to be going south or southwest and getting the heck out of Dodge, because moving to the north is going to bring me into the dangerous semicircle by moving me up to the northern side of the path of approach of this particular storm.
And this goes back to but I mean, this goes back to the original point that we were trying to make about the seaman's eye.
Yeah.
The winds are kicking. I mean, they are kicking. They haven't even reached their zenith yet, but I mean, they are blowing out there. The waves are rocking and rolling. Any sailor worth his salt should be able to tell. I mean, aviators are trained in this by looking at the waves on the ocean surface, and they can tell which way the winds are blowing and all this other stuff. Sailors can do the exact same thing, Bill.
Sure.
So, I mean,
No, I'm gonna part ways here. John, you had a point about Spruance's staff. I want you to make that point, 'cause
I'm looking at that staff. I don't think we need to go there. So
okay, here's the deal, because you sparked a couple of neurons when you made your point, and I'm going to make it. If you don't want to make it, I will. There's a possibility that Spruance's staff was better than Halsey's staff when it comes to things like. Here's the difference: when you're a SWO or a seagoing guy, you're driving ships from the point you're an ensign until, in Spruance's case, he's a 4-star. Right. You're doing nothing but driving ships. If you're an aviator who's populated your staff with a bunch of aviators, your first command may not be until after squadron command, which is 04 in these days, lieutenant commander-ish, right? Then maybe you're going to get command of an aircraft carrier. And they'll give you a deep draft command, so you'll learn how to drive ships, then an aircraft carrier. So you have maybe 7-8 years less seagoing experience than a SWO would have had at this point. Is that decisive in this case? I don't know. But that's, John, when you suggested there might be a difference in staffs, that's what got me thinking about this.
No, I think your point is more germane, to be honest. Yeah, that right. This is just not a guy who has been immersed in ship driving since the very earliest days of his career, either of them, Costco or Halsey. And so, yeah, you got a problem here.
So, to your point, John, what you were saying before, the safest course away from this thing would have been to the southwest. But turning southwest would have also taken Halsey out of position to launch strikes on Luzon the next day, which was a promise that he had made to MacArthur that they would support this operation. And he was bound and determined to keep, which, as we're going to see later, is one of his big defenses when the defecation hits the ventilation in the courtroom, literally. So throughout the fleet, go ahead, Bill.
Let me jump in just for a second here, because this is really key, because my old professor, E.B. Potter, who wrote the Halsey biography, says that this was a decisive point, that Halsey, of course, Halsey died in 1960-ish. Potter might have known him. He knew Nimitz very, very well, and talked to Nimitz about this very thing when they were writing the my history textbook. But Potter's point was that Halsey was reluctant to go to MacArthur and say, we can't support you, General, because the weather is chasing us away. And so he put that in the Halsey text, Halsey biography. Go ahead, Seth.
No, but he's right, though. I mean, he was. Halsey was very reluctant to say, we can't fulfill our mission because
Mhm.
We're about to get, inundated, literally,
Yeah.
in a deluge. So throughout the fleet, skippers and their own aerologist, each ship has an aerologist. Am I right, Bill? Especially the big ones. I know the carriers do for sure.
It's a collateral duty on smaller ships, but yes, you might have enlisted aerographers mates on the
Mhm.
smaller ships, but yeah.
They
Yeah.
were all observing the same weather, and they're coming to their own conclusions. Aboard USS Ticonderoga, Admiral Arthur Radford could see what the seas were doing and told his ship's captain, the incredibly awesome guy, Dixie Kiefer, that, quote, we're in for it, unquote. I mean, these guys could see for their own eyes, with their own eyes, that the seas were about to beat them down. Kiefer agreed and ordered his ship on his own, like without any command above him, to secure for a typhoon, even if the fleet hadn't called it that yet. Others agreed throughout the fleet. Aboard Yorktown, the ship's aerologist spoke with Captain Combs, the ship's captain, and told him, quote, I suggest you fuel our DDs now. We are in for some bad weather, unquote. Captain Combs said that fueling would begin in a few hours, and the aerologist again said, the weather's getting worse. We should do this now, sir, unquote. Again, he is ignored. Several hours later, after fueling had stopped due to bad weather, the aerologist simply said, I told him so. So, I mean, this is the thing that's maddening about this is that literally people across the fleet are saying, we need this is bad. We need to batten down the hatches and get the heck out of Dodge. And yet the boss with his fleet aerologist seemingly is off in
Yeah. Kind of sleepwalking through this whole event.
yeah, yeah. So as the fleet begins to move towards its new rendezvous point for refueling, the seas continued to grow. They continued to get worse. Task group commanders issued orders contrary to Halsey's to continue fueling ops for the small boys as best they could, the destroyers as best they could, because these guys are not stupid. They're going back to what Bill was saying earlier. They have to have fuel, number one, or John, rather, I'm sorry. They have to have fuel to operate in a storm. And then on Bill's point, they have to have some sort of ballast so they can ride through this thing that they're
It's coming.
clearly in. Yes, no doubt. There's no question anymore.
It's not coming anymore. We're here.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
in it. You're in it. As the Oilers tried to fuel the ships throughout the fleet, things just got worse, and it became clear that they were wasting their time. Unfortunately, that window of opportunity, as small as it was, had been shut, and you were gone. It's too late at this point now. USS Hickox was at 18% fuel and would need all the fuel she could, John, to your point, to steer into what was apparent to all with a weather eye, a typhoon that was fast approaching. It literally, it's like watching a slow motion train wreck
Yeah.
unfold before your very, very eyes. So, Bill, tell us about Nahinta Bay, USS Nahinta Bay.
Yeah,
Nahinta
so
Bay.
they had also rendezvoused to fuel, and Captain Horace Butterfield, got on TBS talk between ships and asked Captain Jasper Acuff, who commanded the fueling group, if he thought that they had run away from the storm. Acuff responded that his weatherman thought that they had run out of it that they may run out of it by morning, but either way, they were going with it. What Acuff nor anyone else knew, the storm was actually following Task Force 38. Aboard Lexington, Admiral Bogan suggested to Halsey and Costco that the fleet turn south. Costco considered the change and then received a report long overdue. At 14:30, he finally received Sandler's report, nearly 15 hours old yet. But remember, this is 15 hours. It's less than 24 hours all this has happened.
Right.
As he read the report, he knew that he had made a serious mistake. Okay, so now he finally knows. So he's going to do the right thing, right? Right? Wrong. At this point, with the speed given, the storm that he thought was 400 miles away was now merely 125 miles away to the east. Badly out of date, the storm could even be closer. Now remember, this storm is traveling at you at 15 to 20 knots. His ships want to do 15 to 20 knots, but that consumes fuel faster, and they are already nearly out of fuel. So they're doing 10 knots. Are they going to outrun the storm? They're not, obviously, not at that speed. So believing the storm would head to the northwest, Costco now felt the Third Fleet was sailing directly towards it, favoring a more southwest route. He
Which he
suggests
should
to
have done
Halsey,
earlier, by the way. Just
Yeah.
he suggests to Halsey, who demurred, thinking it's too close to the kamikazes. Folks, as I've said 100 times on this program, the sea is trying to kill you. You've got a hypothetical threat, the kamikaze, and a real threat,
Yep.
the storm. So Halsey issues orders for the fleet to turn south unwittingly. And I have a map to show this. I'll show it whenever you want me to, Seth.
Bring it up.
Halsey's driving the fleet
Bring it.
directly. Bring it now. Okay. Here
Do
you
it.
go. Look. So here's the first course. Here's the storm. Right? Costco recommends they go to the north, which
Beautiful.
is right into the path of the storm. And then Halsey says, no, we can't go. We're going to turn around and go south. Right back into the path of the storm.
Brilliant.
You couldn't screw this up worse if you tried, folks.
Yeah.
I'm getting worked up, Seth. I better hand it back off to you.
but it's true. It's infuriating. You know, if you have, and John, you know, and we beat the dead horse about Halsey's staff before, but it's true though. If you are relying on your staff to give you pertinent information that is going to direct the path and, or in this case, safety of your fleet, you theoretically should be able to trust these people because they're the best in the business. And yet there's clearly between Halsey and Costco, there's a lot of, well, maybe should we, or should I not, you know, and that to me suggests, I don't want to say mistrust, but a lack of understanding of the weather conditions and the lack of understanding of the entire situation. And that falls on obviously Halsey, but Costco too, who's the guy he's relying on at this point.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, I will say though, Seth, I made this point when the Roosevelt had problems with COVID, and you've got medical advisors, but it's the commander's decision, right?
Sure.
You can take the advice of your advisors all day long, but in final analysis, you're going to be held responsible for the decisions that are made, right? They're just advisors. You're the commander. And so Halsey, now we'll talk about the outgrowth of this later, but he can't shield himself by saying, well, my aerographer said that doesn't work in the military.
Right. Yeah. The buck stops here, man. Buck stops here.
Mm-hmm.
So as dawn breaks the following day, the seas are, no surprise here, getting worse. The barometer aboard the ships is dropping like a rock. That's a clear indicator that heavy weather is in the mix. Winds are in excess of 50 knots. Swells are increasing in height. In some spots in the fleet, 30 to 40 feet high, and they're only going to get worse.
Yeah.
The skies are gray and the waves are pushing down from the north, indicating that to any experienced sailor that the storm was to the north, and if the fleet had stayed its course, it may have missed said storm. Instead, and this is the following day now, keep in mind, Halsey astonishingly orders the fleet to turn north and commence fueling operations again. After an hour, he realized it was impossible, and the fleet turned south again. And at this point, it's flat out too late.
Yeah. That's the second north turn, and there was the second southern turn. Well, he's trying to he's dancing in front of the Typhoon.
Yeah,
this is crazy.
It. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I did a little looking into this particular storm just to try to figure out, there's conflicting information out there as just to how powerful it was. Some people say it was a category 2. Others say it's a category 5, which I find a little hard to believe. But there was a pretty detailed scientific study done by a group of Korean authors who were trying to at least recreate the significant wave heights in this storm. And their analysis shows that H-sig, which is the average of the upper third highest waves, that H-sig in this storm was between 12 and 15 meters. So that's 40 to 48 feet. And the thing that makes that a little scary is that means that there are rogue waves out there roaming around. These are very short-lived in duration, but the longer you're in a storm like this, the higher your chances of running into one of these puppies. Typical definition of a rogue wave is a wave that has a height that is greater than 1.86 times H-sig. Okay, so that means that there could be rogues out here 80, 90 feet tall. And to give you a sense of perspective, the bridge of a Fletcher-class destroyer is 36 feet above the waterline. So already just the normal HSIG waves are a good 20 feet above where you're standing, or at least 10 or 15. So these destroyer skippers are looking up a lot of the time at these things. And there could be monsters out there, which not only are significantly higher, but the other thing about a freak wave is that it typically has a much steeper wave face to it, and they are often breaking seas. And those breaking seas exert just enormous dynamic pressures that can shatter steel and whatnot. And that's the kind of stuff that these destroyer skippers now have got to watch out for, bobbing like a cork with insufficient ballast.
And that is exactly what is going to happen.
Yep.
At this point, Halsey orders that fueling to stop, and for the ships that are exceedingly low on fuel to do what Bill had said earlier, which he should have probably done the day before, which is to ballast down with seawater. And again, and this is interesting, and we can get into this later when we get into the courtroom sessions if we want to, is that some skippers flat out just said, nah, I'm not doing that. And I mean, that's on record. That's on, courtroom records that some skippers literally said, nah, I don't have time for that. It's too late now. And they didn't even give it a shot.
How long does it take to ballast down a ship?
I was going to ask that.
A couple hours. A couple hours.
A couple hours in calm seas or rough seas, or does it matter?
I don't think it matters.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I mean, something's better than nothing.
So frankly, I don't know why they wouldn't have wanted to do this. I just
that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't. Okay. It doesn't at all. And I think that's part of the problem, frankly. And about an hour or so after sunrise, nobody could see the sun anymore for the storm clouds. And I've been in situations like this. It's pretty hairy. Visibility worsened and the seas climbed, waves becoming virtual mountains. These are these waves that John was talking about, of water that crashed into ships all across the fleet. Winds picked up, going from 50 sustained in excess of 70 knots sustained in a matter of 2 hours. 70 knots sustained winds. That's a serious blow. That's a hell of a wind.
Yeah, and the storm is eventually going to record sustained wind speeds of somewhere between 137 and 160 miles per hour. Now, that's less in knots. I can't do it off the top of my head. That's probably about 140 knots top and maybe 130. But yeah, there's some very serious winds out here.
Mm-hmm. And combined, of course, it's just going to make for a witch's brew, if you will. So across the fleet, Admiral McCain issued orders that stated, clear the decks and steer with the wind off their port quarter. At 13:45, Halsey issued his first typhoon warning, which was a little bit late at this point.
Gee, I had no idea that this was coming now that I'm in the middle of it. Yeah, right.
And it's been beating you down for over 24 hours now.
Right.
By the nature of their design, and this is one of those rogue ways you're talking about, John, and I found this to be utterly fascinating and terrifying at the same time. By the nature of their design and construction, battleships were generally considered to be the most seaworthy and stable vessels of the fleet. I mean, all you got to do is look at the damn things. Big, beefy monsters. They were
plenty of girth.
Yeah, I mean, just big girls, big
they
girls that
build
can
them
take it
that way intentionally because that makes them stable gun platforms too. So yeah, they generally tend to ride these seas better than pretty much anything else.
Aboard USS Washington, BB-56, Herbert Scotty Campbell said, quote, we had a sofa in the chart house and the quartermaster and I were sitting on it when one of the biggest waves I have ever seen hit the ship. The sofa, the quartermaster, and me all went across the room and slammed into the bulkhead. In the wardroom, the mess tables were thrown across the length of the room some 80 feet. We were riding better than most everybody else I saw, but even we were taking a beating.
Right.
Hold on, John, it gets better. By 1400, Washington had approached to within 30 miles of the eye. Quote, torrential rains blotted out everything except objects within 500 feet, unquote. Hunter Cronin, who had been on Washington for years, recalled, quote, the ship would just roll and then stay there. A battleship. Yeah. Just roll and hang there. He said, I was more scared than in any other battle. And by the way, Hunter Cronin had been on the battleship fight in November 42. Our weather officer went to the foremast to take pictures 113 feet up, and he was drenched by white water.
Yeah. Again, I don't know what the
Wow.
Beaufort sea state here that we're operating in. It's probably, at least a 10. And yeah, it becomes really difficult to distinguish, where does the water end and the atmosphere start? It's it's a storm. And I'm going to plug here. Anybody wants a good sense for what it's like to be in sort of heavy seas, I can't recommend The Perfect Storm strongly enough. I mean, yeah, it's a popular bestseller, but it's a really good sort of history book too, and really goes into the meteorology and just the physics around waves and storm mechanics. Is really, really good. So for what that's worth.
The the sheer
You're
fact.
smiling down there at me though.
Junger is a good guy. I met him after 9/11. Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mhm.
The sheer fact that the battleship Washington,
Right.
not a small vessel by anyone's standards, is taking white water
Yeah.
113 feet on her foremast.
Yeah. Well, and one of the
That's serious.
carriers recorded 90-foot seas coming over her flight deck forward. I think that was the Hancock. And so, again, you're not getting that consistently because your HSIG is about 48 feet or something like that. But again, there are these puppies out there that, are breaking seas that are twice as tall. And the longer you stay in this system, the better your odds you will run into one of these things.
Washington's radio man, or one of them, Chet Cox, said, quote, "You could feel the ship vibrate and toss around like we had hit a brick wall. She was coming up and going down, up and down. You could feel the gravity under you. I wanted to puke." I bet he did. It was around then that we started getting plain language distress calls from 2 or 3 destroyers. If we were pitching like this, it must have been hell on those cans, unquote. Indeed, it was. Again, if there's a reason that they call destroyers tin cans, it's a nickname that is well earned. Bill, in this typhoon that you were in on the surface, could you see any other ships within your area, or were you guys alone?
No, we were by ourselves, so it wasn't an issue from that collision standpoint. But what happened was we were in Hong Kong and we couldn't get, and the 2/3 of the crew was ashore and couldn't get them back on the submarine before we got underway. And so we ended up running to the Philippines on the surface with 1/3 of the crew to man the watch stations, right? So I actually stood an enlisted watch because we didn't have enough of those qualified watchstanders to do that. And it was, we shut all the hatches. We tried keeping people on the bridge. We were getting green water over the bridge, which I've had to live through green water over the bridge many times, not in typhoon, so that's not a big deal. But we were worried that the periscope would get bent over by the waves. They were hit so hard. So anyway, that's not germane to this conversation. But what I will say is the 1/3 of the crew that was on board, I'd say 3/4 of that 1/3 were so sick, people were carrying buckets around with them. So I understand what they're saying. And of course, aboard Monaghan, DD-354, we know Monaghan from a different battle. What was that one, Seth?
Monaghan was all through the Solomons, man. She was everywhere. USS Monaghan. She
everywhere.
She was in both of the Friday the 13th battle.
Yep. And so the Farragut-class destroyer, she began taking a pounding early on. Top heavy from additions of radar and extra gun mounts, which is really good when you're in battle. Really bad if there's this thing called metacentric. Yeah, metacentric height is the distance between your center of buoyancy and your center of gravity. The gravity needs to be below the buoyancy or you capsize, right? And the bigger that different distance between your center of buoyancy and the center of gravity, the metacentric height, the bigger that distance is, the more stable you are, because the buoyancy tends to lift the ship while the ends to stabilize, and the center of gravity tends to pull the keel down, which is stabilizing. But when you add a bunch of weight in the superstructure with radars and all these extra sensors, if you don't take ballast out above the weather deck somewhere, what happens is your metacentric height decreases, which increases your instability. Way more technical than you needed.
No, but that's incredibly important, because what we're going to see happen to two of these three destroyers that, spoiler alert, as you always say, go down, is that they're the same class. So,
Mhm.
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
continue, Bill. Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, that's it. So, the issue here is that the extra weapons and radars and things like that, which are really good, and as we've said a bunch of times, throughout the war, every time you go back into a depot maintenance period, you get the newest, best, and greatest stuff put on, which is great for warfighting. Not so great when it destabilizes your buoyancy like this. And the little ship
Right.
rode waves harder than most. Her skipper, only 2 weeks on the job, was in over his head. A crosstalk between ships, he came the chilling transmission, unable to steer course, cannot get out. That's panic, folks. That is, panic that he's trying to hide. Another transmission from Monahan. Have tried full speed, but it will not work. In other words, he can't keep the ship's head.
Yeah.
In other words, the storm is deciding what course. Once you go beam to the waves, you
So,
begin to capsize.
Right.
Then silence, and that's all she wrote.
Yep. Yeah, the problem with destroyer, of course, is it's not built necessarily for seakeeping. It's built for speed. And so you have these very long, narrow hull forms. And yes, if you get beam to in a heavy sea like this, you don't have that width that you do in a battleship. It's pretty easy to get capsized, and that's exactly what starts happening here. And Monahan is the first.
she is. And unlike her mates, she wasn't low on fuel. She had been able to fuel. She
Mm,
was just simply, like Bill was saying, was unstable. So she
yeah,
wasn't full by any means, but she certainly had enough fuel to ride out the storm had she been able to not pitch
yeah,
and roll like she was. But because of the additions of weaponry and radar and everything else that Bill was talking about, she was no longer, she wasn't built for all that kind of stuff, is what it amounts to. This is a pre-war destroyer.
yeah,
Um, she's running at full speed. So she simply would not move in the waves. She was virtually standing still.
yep,
Fear aboard the ship from the few survivors there were was beginning to spread like absolute wildfire. Men gathered in the head and prayed as the ship heeled as much as 70 degrees.
So you're walking on the bulkheads at that point,
yeah,
folks.
yeah,
Let
70
that sink in.
degrees. The wind, and John, to your point, the wind and waves to literally began to beat Monahan to pieces. Deep inside the ship, the engine room and fire room actually began to separate from the bulkheads that held the ship together.
yeah.
She was
Meaning,
literally coming apart at the seams.
yeah, very heavy torsional forces here that are not only, bending the ship down, but skewing it around its axis too. I'm amazed that that report even made it to daylight. I mean, that suggests that somebody from the engineering space has actually survived this sinking, which I find just almost
Unlikely.
miraculous. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, it gets worse. As
yeah,
she heeled over once again, nearly 72 degrees, her power and steering went out. The lights went out, telephones, anything powered by electricity was dead. Her engine still ran, but for how long, it was anyone's guess. She
yeah,
was pounded by just wave after wave after wave after wave. She rolled again, and this time did not come back up. She laid on her beam ends. Water poured down her funnels into the superstructure in any opening it could find. She was done. At that
yeah.
point, it's over with. She capsizes, trapping most of her crew inside of her. But she's not the only one. Bill, tell us about Hull.
Yeah, it's another Farragut class ship, Seth. As you said, the similar scene was playing out. Literally pinned by towering waves, the little ship tossed out of control. Water came pouring into the ship as she lurched to starboard. Water pooled in the engine room. The bilge pumps were started but aft, and there was no power to the pumps. As you lose engines, you lose the generators, you lose power to the pumps. And water began to swish from one side to the next, further destroying her stability. The ship's captain tried to turn her into an easier riding position in the storm, but as she turned, sea grabbed her and wouldn't let go. All control was lost. Captain Marks had delayed ballasting with seawater, and now he paid the price. The ship rolled some 80 degrees. So again, walking on the bulkheads. Men held on to anything they could grab as the ship rolled. Everybody rigs for sea, but I guarantee the rig for sea is never perfect. Things are falling all over the place. People are getting hit by falling debris. They're
Yep.
getting injured and killed by that, even the ones who can hang on. Hatches are swinging shut, cutting off fingers. This is ugly. This is really ugly. And so anyone who tried to force the way out of a hatchway couldn't, as the winds had increased 110 knots. So the weather deck hatches, you can't open them against the force of the wind. Those fuel souls who were topside or tried to escape were swept out to sea.
Yeah. Yeah, this is drowning in a capsizing like this is just one of the things that kind of chills my blood. This is so how not I do not want to die this way. And because again, accounts of capsizing is like a house turning over, and you're absolutely right. There's debris, there's objects, and you're in pitch darkness now. How the hell do you find a way out if you're not in some battle station that is relatively close to topsides where you can squeeze out a hatch or something like that? It's game over, and it's game over. That's the terrifying part. If you're in the engineering spaces here, you're not getting out of this thing. So yeah, pretty hair raising.
It's a hell of a way to go.
Yeah, it really is.
Literally one of the nightmares I have.
Yeah.
As soon as she, unlike Monahan, that like kind of beat herself to death and then rolled and it was going. As soon as Hall rose over, that's it. She's gone. Like,
you'd be surprised how fast these ships go down too. I mean, you've got an initial period here. Once this thing is over on its side and it's clear that bad things are happening, you've got about 30 seconds to get out of this ship. Because once you get down flooding into a steel-hulled vessel, there's a video out there on YouTube of a big bulk freighter, 200,000-ton vessel, being deliberately scuttled in deep water. And it's slow to start, but at the end, it's just absolutely terrifyingly quick. You're talking about an accommodation, which is the equivalent of an 8-story building, just being sucked down like a giant hand is just pulling the ship underneath. And that's exactly what's happening to these destroyers, too. Once they go down and you get down flooding through the funnels, you've got a very short amount of time to get out of this thing before it's over. We're not talking a matter of minutes. It's very, very fast. Yeah.
Well, these two Farragut class are not the only ones to feel the wrath of this storm. USS Spence, which was a Fletcher class, one of the newer destroyers in the fleet, and certainly more stable, if as far as a destroyer can be, than a top-heavy Farragut class. She wasn't having much of an easy time either. Her Captain Andrea, hadn't ballasted with seawater either. Now, if you recall earlier in the story, this is the very same destroyer that had come alongside USS New Jersey. And almost caused Halsey, did cause Halsey to duck at the incoming destroyer. She had been riding fairly well, even that she had taken on some fuel. She had also, as I said, had not ballasted with seawater either, but she was riding fairly well until it started to get really, really bad. She just got into a really nasty portion of the sea. Frequent reports of man overboard were heard by the captain, who could do literally nothing about it. As the storm grew, the water began pouring down her funnel. When that happens, it's over with. She loses power. Everything goes black. Wind is on her starboard quarter now. She took a blast from the sea from astern. And John, you had some notes on this.
Yeah, again, sometimes and this happens in commercial fishing boats too, you will decide if you're just getting pounded too bad across your bow. I mean, among other things, it can blow your bridge windows out. You don't want that. So then when that happens, you turn around and you run down sea. And the problem with that is that, okay, maybe my bridge isn't taking a beating anymore, but now my stern is getting shoved around by these seas that are coming across the stern, and it's very difficult to maintain your heading. And particularly in the case of smaller boats, you can also get your ventilation knocked out and your engine intakes too, which again, if you get a loss of power, it's all over.
And that's essentially what happens here.
Yes.
She heels over to port and she just hangs there. She did slowly recover, but she had a list at that point. The captain orders hard right rudder into the seas, and he again tries to gain control, but at this point she gets smacked again. She rolls another 50 degrees, and instead of coming back, she stays there. And
Right.
at that point, when she stays there, she just keeps on going. She capsizes too, and Spence is gone as well. All right, so Bill, once Spence goes down, that's I don't even want to say mercifully, but that is the last of the ships to go down. However, even the larger ships, now we've talked about the destroyers taking an absolute pounding. Even the larger ships are taking a beating here.
Yeah, they weren't making it out easy, certainly better, but not easy. Well, the big ships could ride the storm out better. The Independence class CVLs were having a hard time of it. Narrow on the beam, being built on cruiser hulls, remember that, and top heavy. My comments about metacentric height pertain here. With flight decks, the CVLs were taking a beating and rolling viciously. Hellcats on the USS Monterey, which is CVL 26, broke loose and were swept away. Below in her hangar, her aircraft were straining at their lines that had been tied them down. Men ran to tighten the lines, but as the ship rolled 34 degrees, imagine that, aircraft carrier rolling 34 degrees.
Yeah.
One of the Hellcats broke free of its lines and went sliding back and forth, crushing everything in its path. The plane suddenly burst into flames. It had been drained of fuel, but there's always some fuel, and of course the fuel vapor is what really burns. Now, the officer of the deck on the Monterey was some guy named Gerald Ford. You young people. He was president of the United States. A lot of the presidents had been in the Navy, Eisenhower famously in the Army, but a lot of them had these cushy JAG type of jobs because they were lawyers. Gerald Ford was a line officer, to his credit. He was not a lawyer. Do your history here. Gerald Ford, when he was president in 1975, they had a Christmas party. They invited some midshipmen to be window dressing at the White House Christmas party. I got to be one of those guys. And I got to meet Gerald Ford. And this is all he wanted to talk about, the fact that he was officer of the deck when a fire broke out on the Monterey during the hurricane, the typhoon, and he ran down below decks to make an assessment how bad the fire was. He sadly assumed that we midshipmen knew enough naval history to know what the heck he was talking about. I had no clue what he was talking about. I've talked previously about the fact that when I saw the movie Jaws and they talk about the USS Indianapolis, I didn't know what that was. I'd asked my professor, E.B. Potter, is that a true story? And he says, yes, it is. After this holiday Christmas party, when we resumed classes in January, I'd ask my professor, President Ford was telling us about a fire on the Monterey, and he was off. What's he talking about? So this is how I learned what I probably should have known before I went to the White House, Seth.
So
this is another one of those I cannot imagine anything I would less rather do than fighting an avgas fire in a hurricane on an aircraft carrier. It's just like
in a hangar, your hangar.
Right. Yeah. The only thing that's missing is like feral, rats running around or something. I don't know. It's a scene out of hell.
Rats would be better. Yeah, you're trying to. The deck, the ship is listening to the starboard, listening to the port, and you've got a fire hose, which is hard to manage on a level, and you're trying to approach the fire with a fire hose, and you're sliding down the flight. This is
it's right horrible. Out of Dante's Inferno.
It is. It's exactly right. That's what I was searching for, John. And this is Dante's Inferno.
And it gets worse. This is like the beginnings of it. An explosion, no surprise here, rips through the hangar deck, and several more aircraft break loose, adding to the absolute chaos that's going on in the hangar deck of this aircraft carrier. Fires begin to spread, and smoke enters her ventilation system, spreading to the lower decks of the ship. Crewmen were forced from their stations until they found and donned breathing gear. 3 men are killed miraculously. I mean, God rest their souls, but only 3 guys are killed in this. Literally, it utter chaos on the inside of this little bitty aircraft carrier. By the way, her engine spaces were abandoned briefly. Monterey was forced to stop in the middle of this storm, dead in the water.
Yeah.
And now she begins to just take an absolute pounding from the sea. John, you had a note here
I mean, if she's a smaller ship, she sinks. That's just what happens here. Again, if you lose power in a heavy sea state like this, it's over. So yeah, she's damn lucky that she was as big as she was and they were able to restore power as quickly as they did. One of the other things about these light carriers too, it's not just the fact that they're built on narrow hulls, it's also the fact that they're relatively tall, so they have a lot of sail area. So just the side of that ship, because of the hangar deck and all that stuff, is catching a hell of a lot of wind, which has the effect of also trying to, first of all, turn you to the beam seas and then capsize you too. Thank you very much. I mean, it's just a terrible situation to be in. But she's very lucky they got her power going again.
Exceedingly lucky. Sure, her power is restored. She began to move, obviously. Her sprinklers kicked on, thank God, helping to fight her internal fires. She loses 18 planes that are destroyed by fire or washed overboard. Another 16 are seriously damaged as they careened around the hangar bay during severe rolls. I mean, it's kind of like pinballs in a box, or marbles in a box. Ding, 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 all over the damn place. So if you were in that hangar deck, I guarantee you got the hell out of there damn fast when that started going down. So that evening, the storm finally, mercifully passes. Halsey orders McCain to start a search and rescue operation immediately. He knew he had lost some people. How many men and ships he had actually lost, he had no earthly idea, and it would be utterly shocking when he finally gets the tally. And this is a friggin' amazing story. A hero of the Typhoon was the destroyer escort, DE, Taberer. I don't even know if I pronounced that properly. Taberer.
Yep, that's right.
Which had her foremast and radio antennas washed away and was taking 60-degree rolls. As evening approached on the 18th, Taberer encountered and rescued a survivor of Hull, USS Hull. At that point, her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Henry L. Plage, commenced a box search despite her own serious state. Over the next 51 hours, Plage didn't receive or ignored, and you put in notes, John, I strongly suspect the latter. Yeah, definitely. Repeated orders from Halsey for all ships to regroup at Ulithi.
I can't hear you. I'm picking up people. Thank God for this guy.
Yeah.
Right.
What a badass. Yeah.
During this period, go ahead, Bill. Go ahead.
No, 55 people owe their lives to this guy's unwillingness to follow orders. I'll say it that way.
Yeah. He pulls 41 from USS Hull and 14 from Spence out of the water before being relieved by 2 other DEs. Taberer rescued 10 of the Hull survivors at night. Many were rescued by Hull swimmers who went overboard. Taberer swimmers who went overboard with lines tied around their waist in order to bring the survivors and nets and life rings onto Taberer's side, while other crewmen used rifle fire to drive away the friggin' sharks. Lieutenant Commander Plage was awarded the Legion of Merit and a Navy unit commendation for the ship herself. Well deserved.
Yep.
Well deserved. And this is a DE. I mean, nothing against DEs, but this is a little bitty ship. This is not, the Pittsburgh.
This is a 300-foot ship. Not real big at all. Even a little smaller. Yeah, one of the first veterans associations I was a part of up here in the Twin Cities was the Destroyer Escort Sailors Association. Really great bunch of guys. They were really fun to hang out with. And of course, you hardly ever talk about these guys because they don't get the glamour. But, here's an occasion where these DE crewmen were really above and beyond the call of duty here.
Yeah, I mean, they say 55 guys' lives. Like Bill said, 55 dudes owe their lives
Yep.
to this ship and her crew. Um, the destroyer Brown, DD 546, rescued 6 survivors from Monaghan and 13 from Hull. All told, 93 crewmen who had been washed overboard or survived the sinking of their ships were rescued. 93. And I put in the notes, this info came from Sam Cox's Naval History and Heritage Command, which, by the way, if anybody really wants to go down the rabbit hole, look up Sam Cox's H-grams and read that. That'll keep you busy for about a month. There's some serious material in there.
Sure.
Serious material in there.
Yeah.
As Third Fleet enters Ulithi to take stock of the storm, the losses are absolutely appalling. 3 destroyers had been sunk: Spence, Hull, and Monaghan. Hull took 202 of her crew with her. 62 were rescued. Monaghan took 256 with her. Only 6 were rescued. Spence took 317 with her. 23 of her crew survived. In all, 790 Americans were killed in or as a result of what is now called Typhoon Cobra. A further 27 ships suffered varying degrees of damage, most of it heavy damage that would require significant time in port. There are questions that are going to have to be answered here.
Yeah, you got some splaining to do, Bill.
Yeah. Yeah, you do. And not just face to face with Admiral Chet Nimitz. This is going to be in a court of inquiry. This is a serious, serious offense here. Bill, I know you want to get into this for obvious reasons, but
remember, court of inquiry is an investigatory body, and so it's not something. It's not necessarily negative when a court of inquiry is stood up. It's kind of like a grand jury, but even more innocent than that, because a grand jury, the presumption is that somebody committed a crime, and they're trying to find out if there's enough evidence to charge somebody with a crime. And in a court of inquiry, really is what happened. It's intended to learn lessons and make things better. Sometimes those lessons that you learn indicate that criminal behavior, criminal malfeasance occurred, and a court-martial is appropriate. Most of the time, I would say, though, it doesn't make that conclusion. In this case, though, almost immediately, Admiral Halsey begins his CYA, and you all know what that means. Even before he could issue any sort of statement, both Chester Nimitz and Ernest King wanted to know what the heck happened.
Yeah.
King didn't wait for Nimitz to begin. Nimitz absolutely would have stood up a court of inquiry. He didn't need to be prompted to do it. But King sends a message to both Nimitz and Halsey that says, when convenient, and not to interfere with major current operations, I need to know the circumstances which caused the units of the Third Fleet to encounter the Typhoon. He probably said it just like that, by the way.
Probably, which with a lot more blue language, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. Something he can't put in a naval message. That resulted in loss and crippling of so many combat ships that he considered his combat ships. After sending that message, King absolutely basically was a shot across the bow from him at saying, you better get on this. By the way, the McCain we keep talking about, that was Senator McCain's grandfather. Okay?
That's right.
And so, because Admiral McCain, McCain's grandfather was an admiral, McCain's father was an admiral. McCain likely would have been an admiral if he stayed in the Navy long enough, despite his POW-ness, like Admiral Lawrence, who was a POW in Vietnam with McCain, became an admiral. But there's a lot to fallout to come here, Seth.
Oh, big time. And the message that King sent to Nimitz, just to Nimitz, by the way, said, quote, requested if practicable that SINCPAC initiate ultimate desired administrative measures employing personnel not attached to Task Force 38. Please advise. King was hot. King was hot. He was he was livid. Nimitz wasn't pleased either. Nimitz was angry too, but King was absolutely fit to be tied at this moment. Halsey, when he receives this message from King, he knows he's got to know, as I said before, this is a pucker moment. This is when Halsey's like, ooh, this could be bad.
And I'm already in hot water from Leyte as it is.
Yeah. So this is what did I say? December? Yeah, so this isn't even 2 months.
December.
Yeah, it's not even 2 months since Leyte Gulf, since the whole
screwed the pooch there. Yeah, right. So
indeed. Halsey responded immediately that he blamed the weather data and the fact that his destroyers were low on fuel. This is his initial response. Halsey would sing, again, as I put in the notes, the same old song over and over again over the next several days and weeks. And John, to your point exactly.
Yeah, my dude, whose fault was it that they was low on fuel? Yeah.
You can almost, at that point, you can almost say maybe McCain, because this is his task force.
Right.
I mean, Halsey's fleet commander for sure, but McCain's Task Force 38. So, I mean, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, the ultimate blame falls on Halsey, but would it not be McCain's fault that his ships were that low?
McCain's responsible to Halsey to make sure that his fleet, his task force, is ready for action at any time. Sometimes that action is combat action. Sometimes that action is storm evasion action. But he is responsible. He'd only been in the job, a month at this point?
Yeah.
But I got to say, Nimitz wasn't sold on McCain to begin with for a whole bunch of reasons that have nothing to do with this storm. So there's some issues here. He thinks he's a reasonably competent flag officer, but he doesn't. We'll go into this a little bit as it proceeds, because the Court of Inquiry is going to uncover a lot of this.
It is. And Nimitz issues a statement. It says, quote, the court will further give it. He orders the Court of Inquiry. Nimitz does, obviously. So to pile onto that, he says the court will further give its opinion as to whether any offenses have been committed or serious blame incurred. Will specifically recommend that further proceedings be had. End quote. In other words, if you find something that is court-martial offense, then we're going to go through with it. That we're not, I'm not holding back here at this point. So that'll give you an indication. We've all praised Chester Nimitz till we can't praise him anymore, but that'll give you an indication of how serious he was taking this. And he's no fool. Bill Halsey is his buddy. He's known Halsey for years and years and years and years and years. But this will tell you how serious both he and King, but specifically Nimitz, was taking this. And I think this is unprecedented. Am I wrong? From Nimitz's standpoint?
A couple of times when he established a Court of Inquiry for the Indianapolis. We'll go that later in the season, right? That did result in a court-martial. He recommended against that court-martial. I'm jumping forward. I'm jumping ahead. In this case, we'll see how it proceeds.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, so the Court of Inquiry runs for 8 days straight. It examined personnel such as Halsey's Chief of Staff, Mick Carney, we've talked about him before, and the captains of the sunken ships. Costco took the stand where he presented his aerological estimations and the data that he had figured. And we'll get to our conclusions here in a second. In the area of Costco specifically, it was evident, and you can read the testimony, it's all there. Given his testimony that he was spinning a long yarn, essentially to say that due to combat operations, he had been busy, literally, that's what he says, and his aerological estimations of the question as to whether the storm they encountered was an actual typhoon were based on historical weather data from years past. Costco maintained that he hadn't identified the storm as a typhoon until afternoon at 18th, when the fleet was absolutely being swallowed by this thing and had been being battered already for 6 hours. So I put in the notes, this is his own CYA. And again, you can go back and you can read the actual court testimony documents. They're all there. But what fool would mistake the weather that he was stuck in for a mere thunderstorm system? If you're a qualified aerologist, fleet aerologist, not like you were saying, Bill, some seaman on a destroyer, but you are the man. What kind of clown is going to make that misidentification of a storm that bad? Everybody wants to pin the blame on Halsey, and obviously to an extent he deserves it. But this cat here, there's a lot of blame on there's a lot of American blood on his hands, in my opinion. Anyway, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, to your point, Seth, the other aerologists in the fleet, even Monterey's captain, Stuart Ingersoll, testified that their ship's aerologist suggested that the storm was indeed a typhoon on the afternoon of the 17th and stated as much. There were lieutenants, aerologists, there were enlisted aerographer mates who said, wind's veering, pretty clear sign. To a man, they stated the track of the storm was uncertain, kept the weathermen guessing, but there was no doubt in many of their minds that this was developing into a hurricane.
A cyclonic storm. Yeah.
A cyclonic storm, exactly. And so, this is, he might have blamed his combat, duty and things like that. Because what do they do in anticipation of combat operations? They try to figure out where the wind's going to come from, so they're in position to steer into the wind for flight operations. They don't just tell you when it's going to rain. They do have a lot of other responsibilities, right?
Yeah.
So he's
right.
not saying.
The bottom line is, it's your job to predict the weather, and this you did not do.
Not even close, Jack. Not even close.
Yeah.
And that's the key. Right. That's what I'm trying to get, all this bluster to say is that this dude, yes, he was fleet navigation officer for sure. We already said that.
Yeah.
But he's also the head banana. He is the big boss when it comes to the weather, and he just so grossly screwed up.
There is culpability to be assigned here, I think. Yeah.
Big time. But here's the thing. Almost every single one of the other aerologists, of which almost every single one of them, not everyone, but every one of them from a ship that sustained any kind of damage, was interviewed. They all said to a man that they could not predict the storm's track. Well, duh. How often can you, today, look at the hurricane. Yeah, you might be able to get it, kind of close, but it's not an exact science even now. But those statements are what got Costco off the hook. And frankly, in my opinion, he should have been held just as much as blame as we're going to see others get held to here in the near future. But, I don't know. So obviously the star witness to this inquiry is none other than William Halsey. Halsey was brief in his opening remarks, but got more verbose as the questions kept coming. He stuck to his already preformed story that the weather had been bad on the 17th, no kidding, and that he had suspended fueling operations because of that. This was to suggest to the court that he had been aware of the storm's presence. Well, no kidding. How can you not be aware of the storm's presence when you are in the middle of it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Halsey insisted that he and his staff were aware of the disturbance, but were unsure if it was a severe storm. And, if you go back and you read the documents for this court of inquiry, there is a tremendous amount of double talk from these senior officers. It is very clear that they knew they screwed up. And I'm not saying that they, got together and, like a little wolf pack and said, we're all going to cover each other's behinds. Right. But you got to kind of wonder if they got together in a little wolf pack and said, we're all going to cover each other's behinds, because they all covered each other's behinds. And it was very evident that there was some serious issues going on with, I didn't say any of them lied, because they didn't, but they were less than truthful, if that makes any sense at all. Yeah. So the fact remained at the end of the day, and this is what blew both Nimitz and King's mind, is that given his sea experience, and we've pounded on this all episode, which was significant, and Halsey had been at sea for a long time. Admittedly, there was a 2-year gap in the war, but before that, the dude was a highly experienced sea captain. He'd been around the block. He should have been able to determine that the seas were absolutely atrocious, and that he should have had the wherewithal, Bill, your seaman's weather eye, to get his ships the heck away from this friggin' storm and get out of Dodge. And yet he did your zigzag course that you showed in the map, and I'll show it here again now. There it is. That it literally looked like a worm trying to cross a sidewalk. He's just he's all over the map, man. He's all over the map. So whether Halsey was ignorant of the conditions, which is hard to believe, or placed too much faith in Costco, which is what I personally believe, it will never be known. Either way, he slipped the news. Halsey did not receive any real blame at all in this.
And again, remember that he's trying to plan combat operations to support MacArthur. And I'm coming to his defense right now. Can you believe that? So you've got your mind consumed by that. We're going to do fight, we're going to battle, all of that. And Weather Guy, come and tell me if there's anything I should be concerned about so I could shift focus on that thing, right? There's a little bit of truth in that. And I'm telling you what Nimitz and King might have been thinking when they read the results of the Court of Inquiry, right? Yeah, he should have been better supported by his staff. Boy, have I heard that 1,000 times. I have. And again, go back to what I said before. It's your responsibility to say, hey, you know what? This doesn't feel right to me. I'm going to make a decision. I get your recommendation, but I'm going to make a decision. In the end, though, Seth, no charges were filed against Halsey, and the court never found him guilty of any charges. Although they did say that they placed a preponderance of responsibility on him personally. It was damning, but not career-ending for him. And the court did suggest that George Costco be relieved of his position as fleet aerologist. But even that didn't happen, Seth.
Yeah.
And guess what? It's going to happen again. Yeah.
Because why run your fleet into...
Go ahead, I was just
going to say, why run your fleet into one Typhoon when you can do it twice?
Yeah. And this isn't like the second one happened so quickly that we didn't have time to recover from the first one.
Right.
The Court of Inquiry stood up. They actually made recommendations to bring fleet weather ships from the Atlantic and the Pacific. What the heck they were doing in the Atlantic in the first place? In that little pond? I have no idea. But we started bringing fleet weather ships in the Pacific so we didn't have to rely on the PBMs so much. The lessons should have been, kind of absorbed. Tactics should have, there was plenty of time to think about how we would have done it differently, because the second of it doesn't happen until what? June?
Of 45.
Enough time for Spruance to have relieved Halsey, done his thing, which we'll talk about.
Yep.
On Okinawa. And Halsey to take the fleet back from Spruance. And you would say, okay, Halsey's staff has had months to absorb and internalize all the things they did wrong. And of course, they learn every one of those lessons and do it perfectly the second time, don't they, Seth?
No, most certainly not. So just a few days after Halsey relieved Spruance, fleet weather stations reported this is June 1945. Fleet weather stations reported a disturbance in the Philippine Sea again. As in December, this storm held an erratic course, admittedly, but this storm's path came from the southwest. And trying to run away from this storm, Halsey could have gone into open ocean and avoided it. One will remember that the previous storm could have been avoided, aerologist or not, by moving toward Luzon, which Halsey felt exposed his fleet to attack. This one could have been avoided by moving into the ocean, which did not expose him to kamikaze attacks. This storm, named Viper, in which, by the way, I just have to say, Typhoon Cobra, Typhoon Viper.
Yeah. Coincidence? I think not.
But doesn't it sound like two evil,
great names, but they didn't name them those until after the war.
Still cool though. Still cool.
We still ought to name typhoons after snakes. It's good.
Yeah. Typhoon Black Mamba.
Hurricane Copperhead. I like
Hurricane Copperhead.
I think we're getting a little punchy here.
Okay. Yeah, we are. So this one, unlike the previous, held its most dangerous section to the south, not north, as had the previous storm, Cobra. The exact opposite, literally exact opposite of what the previous storm had shown. This, frankly, is just bad luck for Bill Halsey. I have to say, honest to God. Again, had he moved into the open ocean, it would have exposed Halsey to the storm's most violent sector. Now, he's basing his assumptions off of what had happened to him 6 months previous. So that being said, if he decided to move the fleet when he should have decided, he would have missed it entirely yet again. he hangs his decisions on George Costco, who noted this disturbance as a storm and not a typhoon. Again, who cares? As such, he did not advise Halsey to make any movements to avoid. And again, as before, strikes on enemy targets took priority, understandably so. Reports on the storm varied greatly, but one thing was clear: it was certainly powerful. On June 4th, guys, Nimitz's headquarters in Guam, Nimitz has now moved to Guam, issues a typhoon warning of a storm moving towards Okinawa. Costco thought that report was wrong. Because you've been so right so many times before, George. Good gracious. I swear to God. Meeting with Halsey. At one point, Costco meets with Halsey, who admittedly was a bit jumpy over the report. I'm talking about Bill Halsey. Costco suggested that the report was wrong and that Halsey should maintain his current course. Halsey listened and said, quote, "You might be right, but I can't take that chance. I'd like to be south of that typhoon." Halsey, I put in the notes, actually called it a typhoon before Costco ever confirmed that it was indeed a typhoon. By the end of the day, Third Fleet was moving south to avoid the incoming storm. But, guys, Bill, John, Halsey, or Costco still does not believe that the reports did not believe the reports were issued by Nimitz's headquarters and advised Halsey that Guam was wrong. So he had two opportunities for this storm too, to be advised that, we got big weather is saying this and you're saying the opposite. Maybe listen to big weather because we kind of know what we got going on.
Well, yeah, I mean, if nothing else, I mean, if this thing goes south, at least you could have said to the next court of inquiry, I adhered to the advice that I was getting from Fleet Command in Guam. They said this thing was going to do this. I took this course to avoid that thing. It didn't work out, but at least I took their advice, and he's not going to do that.
No, he is not.
No. And again, we had two of the three weather ships in station. The one that could have made a difference in this storm hadn't been put in place yet. So the two that were there were out of place to make to improve the quality of the weather reports. The one that was supposed to be stationed hadn't arrived from the Atlantic yet, so it would have made a difference there. In this case, Seth, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bill. Good.
What I was going to say is Ancon picked up, there's a USS Ancon was headed back from Okinawa to Manila and was instructed to track and report on the storm with her powerful SP radar. And I think you have a photograph of this. You'll probably show what the storm looked like on Ancon's radar. He picked up the storm, reported its position as being much closer to the fleet than anyone suspected. Second time this happened, right? Only 100 miles away. Viper was aiming directly at the fleet. A case of deja vu all over again. And this was Halsey did not receive her transmission for more than 6 hours. Transmissions are always late in the Pacific in World War II, guys. It's always the case. When he received Ancon's report, which I was old now, Halsey began to sweat. Knowing the report might be old, he conferred with Costco, who suggested that the fleet move northwest. Admiral McCain suggested that the fleet hold its current course. Halsey demurred and unfortunately again sided with Costco and ordered a course change directly into the path of the storm. Again, 2 hours after the course change, the Third Fleet was in the middle of the violent storm yet again. So in this case, McCain was right. Keep that in mind as we end this story.
Yeah, no, he totally was. He definitely was. If somebody read the Court of Inquiry papers and learned anything from it, it was John McCain at this point anyway. Unlike the last time, fleet preparations had been made. No aircraft were on the deck. The ones in the hangars had been triple lashed to keep them stable. Destroyers were refueled so that they would ride well, and the fleet actually really, honest to God, battened down the hatches. This storm wasn't as big as Cobra and not quite as powerful, but still violent. Most of the fleet missed the storm, most of it. Yet Task Group 38 won, and the replenishment group, unfortunately, again, 30.8, took a beating. Jocko Clark requested permission to break formation and run, but Halsey delayed his response, and by the time he gave his permission, 38-1 was in the middle of the storm. In truth, the delay was only 20 minutes, so there wouldn't have been much running that Clark could have done, frankly, that would have done him any good.
Yeah, 3 miles, whatever. Come on, man.
Yeah, it's not going to do a whole heck of a lot of good. 6 guys lose their lives in this storm. Both USS Hornet and Bennington had their forward edges of their flight decks smashed. There's pictures of this. I'll show that. I mean, they're folded over like an envelope. I mean, just completely crushed. USS Pittsburgh lost her bow, and 233 aircraft were lost. So after this, guys, and I'm going to hand it over to you two, Halsey felt like his career is it's on a razor's edge of life here, because he knows he's going to be called before a court again, and I mean, what excuses can he have at this time?
Yeah. Well, and I kind of think too, if this was in the middle of the war, he would have gotten the axe. But I feel like we'll get to that part of the story. It's clear that this war is coming to a culminating point, right? We're almost hopefully we're getting this thing over relatively quickly, and maybe they didn't feel that they could get rid of a guy like Halsey, who is frankly a rock star in the eyes of the American public. But
yeah, from E.B. Potter's book, My Old Professor, his biography of Halsey, says, in this investigation, Halsey said the course change was intended to steer the fleet into the safe semicircle of the storm. Go back to the tutorial I did earlier in this podcast. But the statement that my professor made was patently false, because it's easy to figure out whether you're doing that or not. In this case, it's very clear that that didn't happen. They did not move into the safe semicircle. So it was a lie or a fabric, he told a story and people believed it without actually saying, "But wait, did the storm actually do that?
Yeah.
Is that the right course? If that's your intent, did you steer the right course?" Questions, seamen would have known that that's not the case. And by the way, my professor was a bit of an apologist when it came to these senior admirals, and I don't blame him for that. He knew a lot of these guys personally, and they were probably heroes to him, and so okay, I get it. Secretary Forrestal, however, John, to your point, he'd had enough. He wanted to fire Halsey then and there and say, "You're now retired. Your service is no longer required." In this case, King said that there were reasons to fire Halsey, but it would depress the American morale at the crux of our point of victory. It would boost the enemy's morale and may shift the momentum a bit and dim the luster of the Navy at our hour of victory. And so the decision was made. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, it's really hard to put ourselves back in the heads of these people, at 80 years removed, but we don't know how this war is going to end at this point.
It's not over yet.
It's not even remotely over
yet.
The bombs have not been dropped. I mean, as far as we know, we're shaping up to have to invade this place. And, Halsey is a relatively valuable commander. Also, we're probably going to have to get into some come to Jesus moments with the Army over issues of command and whether or not this invasion is going to go forward. I think that there's sort of institutional elements of wanting to be able to show a unified front to the Army in some of the strategic deliberations that are going to be coming up, here in late July, early August. It's for all that we have this mental image now of this crushing American superiority at this point in time. That's not how we felt then, in that the end game for this war was by no means clear at this point in time. And so, you don't want to give the enemy any oxygen at all. And retiring Halsey makes a lot of people say, well, what the hell is going on with that? That's not a good look. Anyway.
And the Japanese were reading our newspapers. I mean, they'd have been aware of that almost as soon as it happened.
For sure.
I will say, and I agree 100%, John. And Somebody, one of our readers and one of our viewers is going to say, "Oh, would they really fire a five-star? He wasn't a five-star yet,
Right.
right? He wasn't a five-star until after the end of the war." That gets into a question about why didn't all these things modulate the decision to make him a five-star? That's a conversation for a different day. I will say, though, this speaks volumes about this cult of personality bit, right? And so you're forced into making a decision because of the cult of personality than rather based on talent. There were other admirals at this
For
point
sure.
in the war that were as skilled or more skilled
For
than
sure.
Bill Halsey. And so
Yes.
we keep him in place just because of his personality, because of the effect that his personality were having on the Americans and the Japanese.
The Japanese.
Now, is that a legitimate military dynamic? If you think you're facing Alexander the Great and you're going to give up because you know you can't beat Alexander the Great,
Yeah.
maybe,
Right.
right? Maybe. But I don't know. I mean, he's not Alexander the Great.
Right.
You know,
And this
is he
has
gonna
always
go?
been my argument about guys like Turner too, that at the end of the day, this is a contest of national and supranational scale systems. And to your
Mhm.
point, Bill, we absolutely have other guys in the batting order that we can put in command of Third Fleet if we need to, who can step in and take that role. It's just that they don't have the glamour factor that Bull Halsey has.
I've
Yeah.
always maintained that he no matter what he would have done, he never would have been relieved of command because of his notoriety within the American citizenry.
Yeah.
He was the face of the U.S. Navy, like it or not, he was.
Yeah,
From literally the
unfortunately.
day
Yeah.
after Pearl
So then
Harbor until now.
you have to invent some sort of
Sure.
alternative command, make him the inspector of something or other and take him out of a
Sure.
direct combat role. That's absolutely what they did with Holland M. Smith when they, determined that this guy is just not a sufficiently good enough team player to have him work with the Army anymore. Make up a position for him. Go do that. So
Yeah.
anyway, we're getting off.
Unfortunately, somebody had to take the fall. If it's not going to be
Halsey.
him,
Yeah.
it's going to
Somebody's
be
going to pay
next.
for this
Somebody's
now.
gonna bite it. Yep.
Nobody, people did pay for Cobra, but none of the higher ups who frankly held all the responsibility paid for Cobra.
Yep.
For Viper, they do. Halsey slips the noose yet again, and yet some of his subordinates, namely Jocko Clark and Arthur Radford, totally pin the blame on him yet again. Admittedly, they did not know what the hell was going on inside USS New Jersey. They did not know that Costco was clearly not fit for his job at all.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact of the matter remains is that Halsey's subordinates are now pinning the blame on him, and that's never a good look. However, somebody does indeed pay for this second Typhoon with their jobs, and it was the guy that accurately predicted the route out of the storm, and it was John McCain. John McCain is relieved of his position.
Seth, being relieved is what kills him. I mean, accelerates his demise. He was devastated by the fact that he was relieved, particularly when he knew that he made the right recommendation to Halsey, and Halsey is coming out of this thing scot-free, and he's being blamed for it. Has that happened before? 1,000 times.
It's the oldest story in the book. Yep.
Yeah. So he's dead in a few months, and that's why grandson John McCain never got to really know him. But that's another story for another day.
You talked about it, Bill, but he was never loved by Admiral Nimitz anyway. And I'm not, saying, I mean, I think that might be part of the reason that he was sent home. Somebody had to hang for this. The first one, somebody, but the second one, somebody had to hang. And again, I fall back on my statement that they never would have relieved Bill Halsey because of his notoriety.
Yeah.
But McCain, somebody higher up had to go. And, if he's already not well thought of by Nimitz, he's going to fit that bill.
Right.
No pun intended. All right. Well, yeah.
A lot of bad weather.
Big time.
2.5 hours on weather. Can you imagine? Right? Isn't weather the joke that you talk about the weather when you don't have anything else to talk about?
Right.
And 2.5 hours on weather.
You get nerds like us in a room together, though, and I want to talk about
Yeah.
H-Sig and freak waves. So,
Mhm.
It's a serious thing, though, man. I mean,
yeah.
at the end of the day, Mother Nature does more damage to the United States Pacific Fleet than the Japanese could have ever done in one sitting.
Yeah.
The Mother Nature deals more damage in a 24-hour span than the Japanese did. So
It's the most ships we lost since Leyte Gulf, right?
Mhm.
yeah.
Um,
Mhm. Yeah.
Albeit that wasn't that far in the rearview mirror, but anyway,
No,
yeah,
no, no,
yeah, it's pretty hair raising.
indeed.
yeah.
All right, gang. Well, anything else we want to add before we wrap this
God, I hope
tempest
not.
up?
No, I want to acknowledge Chris Klasing. Gave a speech last November in South Carolina, and he sent me his dad's paper. His dad served on a signalman on one of these weather ships, and he wrote up a nice paper about the weather
Yeah.
ships. And so, yeah, it was good. So thanks, Chris, for that.
Awesome.
Yeah, I read it too. I thought it was interesting.
Indeed.
Mhm.
Indeed it was. All right, gang. Well, with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching to this episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Please give us a like and subscribe wherever you receive your podcast. We do appreciate it. If you want to see a video version of this, if you're not already looking at it, look at our YouTube channel. If you have a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, my name is Seth Paradon. I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. John, my good friend, thank you for being here with us, and we will see you again very soon.
Yep, pleasure's always mine. Looking forward to being back.
Awesome. Bill,
John,
take us home.
the episodes with John are always really low energy. Did you notice that? So, so much
why you
fun.
bring
Thank
me.
you, Sir John.
That's why they're my
Love you.
favorites.
All right. And we'll see you again next week.